You know, in the modern era of hockey, people always complain every year. Well, Montreal used to win a lot of cups and we're there every year. Well, there's a reason why they're not there every year, and it points back to some bad decisions of the late 70s, early 80s when Lafleur and Lemaire and Dryden and the rest of the key components of the 70s dynasty was going away. Now, entering the 1980 draft, due to some strange dealings, Montreal had the number one overall pick. Now, the player that everybody was talking about was a small but sturdy forward, a centerman, who had a last name that had been on the back of a Montreal Canadiens jersey for years and years and was still on a Montreal Canadiens jersey. Of course, we're talking about the great Denis Joseph Savard, or Denis Savard. Now, Denis Savard played in the NHL for 18 seasons, elected to Hockey Hall of Fame in 2000. He was also named one of the 100 greatest NHL players in history, and eventually became the head coach of the Chicago BlackHawks. The native of Temiskaming, Quebec, grew up in Montreal. He seemed to be the ideal player. He was first actually scouted as a youth when he played in the famous Quebec International Pee Wee hockey tournaments in '73 and '74 with a team from Verdun, Quebec, which of course is kind of the second ancestral home of the Montreal Canadiens. Now, 1979-80 season wasn't the best for Montreal. They had some strange decisions regarding their goalie core, putting in very mediocre goalies to hope it was going to get them past the teams he played. He lost to Minnesota in the second round after beating Hartford. Now, Montreal was the first year in a number of years never made it to the semifinal round. I think it was the first time since 1974. And a lot of Montreal fans said, hey, they're not that stupid. They're going to take Denis Savard because everybody said take Denis Savard. And they didn't take Denis Savard. They took a Western Hockey League prospect by the name of Doug Wickenheiser, a good, honest forward, actually a relation of the great Haley Wickenheiser. But Doug Wickenheiser was basically not the type of player that could fit in the Montreal system because he still needed 2 years of grooming, and when he was first drafted, he went straight in the NHL. He wasn't ready. Savard was ready. Now, he eventually was drafted number 3 and became the highest drafted player in Blackhawks history, and up until Patrick Kane, of course, in 2007. In his first game, he got 3 assists, and then he went on to set the Blackhawks record for most points by a rookie with 75. Now, we had a lot of parallels with the Montreal Canadiens players, especially Sir Savard. He had something called it was a move called the offensive Savardian spinorama, which basically be in the offensive zone and do keep away with the puck, and allowed Savard to whirl around with the puck to defeat, the goalies on the backhand, or, the players that were in front of him. Now, he had 2 big stints with the Blackhawks. Now, the first was from 80-81 to 89-90, and the second was from 94-95. But ironically, he was infamously traded to the Montreal Canadiens for star defenseman Chris Chelios. Now, here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. They didn't have to give up Chelios to get Denis Savard, so technically, Montreal wasted a number 1 draft pick and wasted another top prospect in Chris Chelios for Savard. A lot of people basically believe that it was most of the one-sided trades in original 6 history, as Chelios had some of his best seasons as a Blackhawk, while Savard's career was on decline. Now, although he did win the Stanley Cup in Montreal in '93, he wasn't the main player. Dan Foose and some of the role players. Patrick was more of a defensive team with good first, second, and third line grinders, including Savard. Now, he eventually left Montreal after he won the Cup, and where he played in Tampa Bay for a season and a half. And then he was traded back to Chicago in '96, where he ended up playing a career with the Blackhawks. But in this era of time, ladies and gentlemen, there was only one team that gave Edmonton a real challenge in the Western Conference. It was the Blackhawks. I watched games involving Denis Savard, who individually almost defeated the Edmonton Oilers and Gretzky by himself. They had it with Al Secord. They had some other role players and goal scorers. Savard was basically such a highly skilled player The only thing I say was a combination of sort of Alexander Ovechkin, a little bit of Davy Keon, a little bit of Guy Lafleur, but he had that tenacity being a smaller player. He knew where the net was. And like any good Montreal player that coming through the system, you got to know where the net is. And Denis Savard was a very intelligent player, and as a developer, he's quite strong. He didn't set his main goal. Actually, he said many years ago on the Quebec TV, he said, if I make 500 goals, I'm going to definitely get in the Hall of Fame. But he got in it despite not getting 500 goals. He ended up with 473 goals and 865 assists for 1,338 points with his career. And he trails, get this, only Bobby Orr and Stan Mikita for total points in Chicago history. So in the great history of the Chicago franchise, to be top three with Mikita and Hull. And let me tell you, Savard did well. He was very consistent. He had 100 point seasons 5 times, and he had 7 straight years when he had at least 30 goals, which put him in the top 10 and top 5 some years, the top players in NHL. But for the 1980s, he was definitely top 6 or top 5, because obviously with the Gretzky and the era and the Islanders and all that, there were some championship players on those teams. His highest point total came, of course, in 1987-88 when he had 131 points and he scored 47 goals in 85-86. And a great playoff record with Chicago. As deep as he went in the playoffs, he was the main reason. He had 66 goals and 109 assists for 175 points in 169 games. Now, he was selected to 9 NHL All-Star teams from 82, 83, 84, 86, 88, 89, 90, 91, and 96. And the NHL second All-Star team. Now, in all the NHL categories, he's top 30. And what's really distinctive here, he never won the Hart Trophy for MVP, but was nominated as a finalist 4 times. Now, what the main thing about Denis Savard, he would also be he would get penalties every once in a while. He wasn't scared to defend himself, to take a penalty when need be. But I mean, you look at your stats, when he was traded from Chicago to Montreal, he was on the tail end of his career. But Montreal needed that role player, like Frank Mahovlich was, and like other role players that came to Montreal throughout the years, because Montreal had all role players, in Montreal in '93, and it was like Bellows and Lehman and Savard. You needed those second and third line players to help out with the younger players. But for me, I don't look at the fact that Montreal didn't draft Denis Savard as one of the downturn of Montreal. Montreal's big problem in that era was goaltending. You have to remember, from 1980 to the time Patrick Roy arrived in '85, he tried Steve Penny, he tried Rick Wamsley, he tried Richard Sevigny, he tried Denny Herron, he tried Michel Larocque, and it wasn't working. He didn't have our number one goalie, and I don't think. I mean, drafting Denis Savard would be good, but we really we didn't know back then how good he was. I mean, you can't mistake there. Just because he's the best French player doesn't mean he's going to be drafted. But he was the best available player, and he never took him number one, even if he would score 25, 30 goals. But you got to understand, Claude Lemieux came later on, and Shane Corson, Stéphane Richer, Patrick Roy, all the Chris Chelios. The Montreal maybe had one hiccup year in the draft, and it was 1980. It's too bad, but like Doug Wickenheiser, I mean, he could have been easily a good 20, 25 goal scorer. But I mean, he was a big grinder, and like I said, Denis Savard, being short stature, playing that good Q side, and he ate up the Q there. 3 was the years he was there with the Montreal Juniors. I mean, almost 500 points over a 3-season span. I mean, that's pretty impressive, if you ask me. Now, the only thing that I have a negativity with Denis Savard, he never really had a strong coaching career. I thought he would apply those 3 years with Chicago, but it didn't. It didn't work out. Now he probably should be more involved in the national hockey team in Canada, but he's very happy being working with the Chicago organization. But I consider Denis Savard, other than Gretzky and the key players of Edmonton, the key player of the Islanders. He's definitely top 5, top 10, because you got Peter Stastny in there too. You got Patrick Roy of the 80s. 1980s, he's a top 10 player, obviously, because when he went to Chicago didn't have a possibility of winning anything until he arrived. It was sort of like Doug Gilmour in St. Louis. You look at most of the key players of Montreal. Patrick Roy arrived, it brought him to the next level. It made, get this, Chicago was never considered Stanley Cup contenders, maybe from the mid-70s on. And here, you didn't have to rely on Tony Esposito and net. You didn't have to rely on really bad third or fourth line players. Savard could play on 2 lines. He made like a superstar of Al Secord, of all people, of Austin Reject. I mean, he was that good. So, ladies and gentlemen, on this NHL History Podcast, I usually do Montreal and Toronto, but I thought I'd go out of the way and talk a little bit about somebody that I really respect. Everybody I know that has talked to Denis Savard, you find him a very cerebral guy. But in the parallel universe, Denis Savard on the same line with Guy Lafleur. I mean, but, like I said, it just was a different time. I mean, Guy Lafleur might have quit if Denis Savard arrived, because if you remember, when Guy Lafleur arrived, Jean Beliveau quit. It was a lot of pressure playing as a Frenchman in Montreal. You still feel that. Anyway, and or even like a strong Canadian or NCAA player, there's a lot of pressure playing in Montreal. Would Denis Savard had as much ice time with Montreal as he would have Chicago? No. Did he make mistakes as a player, and he would be benched in Montreal? Of course. Montreal wasn't ready for Denis Savard at the time. Denis Savard was like a late 1980s style player that was more open ice, kind of the European style that Chicago started to develop, like a lot of the Western Conference teams. But I look back at the 1980 draft, and I still hear the stinging commentary from CBC and TVA reporters saying, and this was the separatism era, and you have to separate. One guy said, well, maybe by not drafting Denis Savard, maybe you feel Quebec's going to be in their own country. They were scared to draft Denis Savard because, I don't know, it was a weird time. 1980 was a weird time, anyway. So on this summer day, which is almost 20 degrees out there, we tell you to keep a stick on the ice, and a little shout out to Bo Sheaves and some of the other great NHL fans who are listening to my podcast on a regular basis. I love your suggestions, your likes, your subscribes, your requests. Leave a comment. I'm on Facebook, JJ Carrier. And if you'd like to see me to give you my thoughts on certain things, I'm thinking about doing a podcast on the ugliest jersey of all time. And it's just a hint. It's not of the 1980s or even the WHA. Worst jersey of all time. I'm going to do one podcast coming up that I'll try to find the worst example of these jerseys. And I can tell you it's a bad jersey. It was in a color era, and if you had an old color TV, you couldn't enjoy the game because their jerseys would streak. It's just a hint. So that's upcoming, a little promo. Again, fans of Denis Savard, there's many out there. Please look at his highlights on YouTube, especially a very key playoff game against Edmonton when he went through all 6 players on the ice, including the goalie, and it has, like Harry Neal said, there's only 3 people on the ice he didn't do deke, and 2 are rushers. That was a Jagger comment, but where do you think you got that from?